Most Americans don't think about silver at all. They think about gas prices, rent, interest rates, groceries, or their 401k. Silver sounds old-fashioned, almost irrelevant. Something from the past. Coins, jewelry, maybe a commodity traders talk about on financial TV. But silver today has nothing to do with nostalgia. It is one of the most important metals quietly shaping America's economy, its energy transition, its industrial future, and even its national security. And the reason most Americans don't realize this is simple. Silver does its work invisibly. Let's start with something concrete. The phone in your pocket. Inside, it are tiny amounts of silver. Not because it looks nice, but because silver is the most electrically conductive metal known. There is no cheaper, scalable replacement that performs the same way. The same is true for laptops, servers, medical equipment, satellites, missile guidance systems, and power grids. Now scale that up. The United States is rebuilding infrastructure. The federal government has committed hundreds of billions of dollars to grid modernization, electric vehicles, semiconductor manufacturing, and clean energy. Every one of those sectors consumes silver. Solar panels alone are now one of the largest sources of industrial silver demand globally. Each panel uses only a fraction of an ounce, but when you install millions of panels across the country, the demand becomes enormous. According to industry and energy agency estimates, solar demand for silver has more than doubled over the past decade. Electric vehicles use significantly more silver than internal combustion cars because of wiring density, power management systems, and charging infrastructure. As EV adoption increases, silver consumption rises with it. This matters because silver is not like oil or iron. It is not produced in unlimited quantities. Global silver mining output has been relatively flat for years, and in some periods has declined. Unlike gold, most silver is mined as a byproduct of other metals like copper, lead, and zinc. That means supply cannot easily respond to rising demand with higher prices. Now here is a critical point that directly affects the United States. America does not produce enough silver domestically. According to U.S. Geological Survey data, the United States consumes far more silver than it mines. The country relies heavily on imports, especially from Mexico and Peru. Mexico alone accounts for a large share of global silver production. At the same time, refining and processing capacity is heavily concentrated outside the United States, with China playing a dominant role in several stages of the supply chain. For a country that talks constantly about supply chain security, reshoring, and strategic independence, this is not a small issue. Silver is not just an industrial input. It is a strategic material. The U.S. Department of Defense uses silver in electronics, communication systems, and advanced weapons platforms. Precision-guided munitions, satellites, radar systems, and secure communications all rely on silver components. When defense budgets rise, silver demand rises quietly in the background. When geopolitical tensions increase, the importance of reliable access to silver becomes more obvious. This is not theory. During periods of global stress, governments reassess what materials truly matter. Rare earths, semiconductors, energy metals. Silver belongs on that list, even if it rarely makes headlines. Now let's talk about money, because silver occupies a unique position in the American financial psyche. Silver is both an industrial metal and a monetary metal. That dual role is crucial. When the economy is stable and inflation is low, silver behaves mostly like a commodity. But when inflation rises, debt expands, and trust in institutions weakens, silver starts behaving differently. Over the last several years, Americans have lived through events that fundamentally changed how they think about money. Massive stimulus, supply chain disruptions, inflation reaching levels not seen in decades, interest rates rising at the fastest pace in modern history. At the same time, U.S. national debt surpassed $34 trillion. According to Treasury figures, and interest payments alone became one of the largest federal expenses. When that happens, people start asking deeper questions. Not ideological questions, but practical ones. What happens to purchasing power? What happens when debt grows faster than the economy? What happens when interest payments crowd out other priorities? Historically, silver responds to those moments. In the late 1970s, during high inflation and dollar weakness, silver surged. In 2008, during the financial crisis, silver collapsed and then rebounded sharply as central banks flooded the system with liquidity. In 2020, during global lockdowns and unprecedented monetary expansion, silver again reflected fear, uncertainty, and demand for tangible assets. But today is different in one critical way. This time, demand is not driven only by fear or speculation. It is structural. Silver is being consumed by technology, energy, and industry at the same time that financial stress is rising. Unlike gold, which mostly sits in vaults, silver gets used up. It ends up in products that are rarely recycled efficiently. Over time, that reduces available supply. For the United States, this creates a quiet tension. The country wants to electrify everything. It wants energy independence. It wants technological leadership. It wants military superiority. All of those goals require silver. And yet silver remains largely invisible in public debate. This is why silver matters more to the U.S. than most people think. To really understand why silver is becoming so important, you have to zoom out and look at systems instead of prices. The United States sits at the center of the global financial system. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. That status allows the U.S. government to borrow at lower costs, run persistent deficits, and project power globally. But that privilege depends on confidence. Confidence in institutions. Confidence in productivity. Confidence in long-term stability. When confidence weakens, stress shows up first in the margins. In commodities, in interest rates, in currencies, silver often acts as an early signal, not because it predicts the future, but because it reflects underlying pressure. At the same time, the global competition for industrial resources is intensifying. China has invested heavily in securing supply chains for strategic materials. Europe is racing to meet climate targets that require massive metal inputs. Developing economies are urbanizing and electrifying. All of this increases demand for silver. Meanwhile, mining faces structural challenges. New projects take years to develop. Environmental regulations are stricter. Capital costs are higher. Political risk in key producing regions remains significant. Supply growth is slow, uncertain, and increasingly expensive. This combination matters deeply for the U.S. If silver becomes harder to source, the cost of energy transition rises. The cost of defense systems rises. The cost of technology rises. These costs do not disappear. They are passed on through higher prices, higher deficits, or higher taxes. This is where silver connects directly to everyday American life. When infrastructure projects go over budget, taxpayers absorb the difference. When energy systems become more expensive to build, consumers pay more over time. When defense procurement costs rise, federal spending increases, adding pressure to debt and interest payments. Silver is not the cause of these problems. It is a mirror reflecting them. There's also a psychological dimension. Americans have a long history with silver. It was once part of the monetary system. It was removed gradually, quietly, as the financial system evolved. That history still shapes how people react to it. Silver represents something tangible in a world that feels increasingly abstract. This does not mean silver is a magic solution or a guaranteed hedge. It means it occupies a unique position at the intersection of trust, technology, and power. From a policy perspective, this raises uncomfortable questions. Should the U.S. treat silver as a strategic material more openly? Should domestic production and refining capacity be expanded? Should supply chain dependence be reduced? These are not questions for traders. They are questions for planners, engineers, and policymakers. Yet most public conversations remain shallow. Silver is either ignored or framed as a speculative asset. That misses the bigger picture. Silver matters because it reveals contradictions in the system. A country that wants to lead technologically while depending on fragile supply chains. A country that wants clean energy while relying on materials it does not fully control. A country that wants fiscal stability while expanding debt and interest obligations. When you connect these dots, silver stops being a niche topic. It becomes a lens through which you can see the pressures shaping America's future. So when people ask why silver keeps coming up in conversations about inflation, energy, and geopolitics, the answer is simple. It sits at the crossroads of all of them. Silver is not loud. It does not dominate headlines, but it tells a story for those willing to listen. And that story is not about price charts. It is about power, resources, and the real foundations of the American economy. That is why silver matters more to the United States than most people think.